What is going on, IF Warriors? It's your boy Edward V, and today we're going to look at a brand new study that was just published, randomized controlled study that shows that intermittent fasting provided more fat loss even though the caloric restriction within the other group was exactly the same. We're going to go ahead and dive into this groundbreaking study in this video. Stay tuned. Before I go into this video is sponsored by Flex Pro Meals. We know that intermittent fasting enhances the body fat loss, but still calorie control has to be there. Flex Pro Meals can actually work to your advantage while utilizing intermittent fasting, because if calorie control is very difficult for you and it's just something that you just can't wrap your head around, or you're struggling through that, Flex Pro Meal provides the calorie count, the macro count, so you can pick the meals that you want. They actually pre-cook them, pre-make them, pre-portion them, and then they send them right to your doorstep. I get it. I know the calorie counting and portioning is difficult for some people, so this is actually a really good alternative for the price. I've used them myself, and believe it or not, their food is actually delicious. I have a link down in the description for you, and if you enter the promo code Fledge20, you'll get 20% off your entire first order. Now let's go ahead and get back to the video. Now, one thing that makes this study really appealing, especially to me, is that it was done with all women. It was 88 women that were selected. The reason why this is important is because women don't normally get selected for these kind of intermittent fasting studies. Normally it's a mixture or just men, but this study was ran by Amy Hutchison and colleagues, and they decided to buck the trend and go directly towards if it works well for women. And it isn't pseudo intermittent fasting or aggressive calorie restriction being dressed up as intermittent fasting. It is 100% fasting. And what they did was a 24-hour fast. So there was 4 groups in total. There was the intermittent fasting group utilizing caloric restriction. There was the caloric restriction group that restricted the exact amount of calories as the intermittent fasting group, except that they ate their meals throughout the day, while the intermittent fasting group fasted for 24 hours every 2 days. There was an intermittent fasting group that ate 100% of their daily caloric intake so that they would remain at maintenance. And then there was a control group that ate throughout the day, also at 100% calorie intake. These were the 4 groups that were utilized for this study. The setup was randomized. Of course, the way that they selected everybody, there were limitations. If you were pregnant, if you were breastfeeding, if you were on medication, if you have certain medical illnesses, you were omitted from the study. They wanted to get as accurate a number as possible. The study was heavily controlled as they provided all of the meals for all of the participants. The macro breakdown was interesting. It was 35% fat, 50% carb, and 15% protein. As I've mentioned in the past, intermittent fasting works regardless of a higher carb intake because those hormonal processes are at work when you fast. Reduction in carbs can definitely assist you, but it isn't a necessary protocol to reduce carbs to experience benefits from intermittent fasting. Now, they didn't just look at weight loss and fat loss. They looked at metabolic parameters. They looked at insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. They looked at LDL, HDL cholesterol. Essentially, they wanted to cover all the bases. And the results are in line with what happens when you do 100% caloric restriction during the fasting period, where there's 0 calorie consumption when you fast, allowing that activation system to work. And the beautiful thing about this is it was done with women, because all the studies that were done in the past in which they reference women not being able to succeed with intermittent fasting, they just use rat studies but not human studies. So people just going by studies that were done on rats. But if grouped with men and women, 0 caloric intake still had a positive effect on that entire group. But this omits men and still shows a positive effect for the entire group for women. Now, I love the setup that they did because they had caloric restriction versus intermittent fasting and caloric restriction. So the calorie restriction was exactly the same, which is the fact that each person ate 70% of their caloric intake for the week. And they had the control group with the intermittent fasting group that did not restrict calories and ate 100% of their caloric intake for the week. And the reason that having all of these groups makes sense is because you want to see how intermittent fasting works without reducing calories, and you want to see how intermittent fasting works while reducing calories, but you want to evenly compare the two. And what the findings of this study found is that intermittent fasting, when applying a caloric restriction equal to that of simply caloric restriction while eating throughout the day, provided the best and more significant fat loss over all the other groups. The caloric restriction, however, provided better fat loss when caloric restriction was not applied to intermittent fasting. However, intermittent fasting without caloric restriction provided some fat loss, albeit not significant, but more than the caloric maintenance group. So IF caloric maintenance actually provided some fat loss. The caloric maintenance group had the worst numbers, but the critical thing is that the intermittent fasting group lost significant body fat, more than all of the groups. Also, one thing to note from this study, all of the healthy metabolic stuff like the LDL control, the HDL control, were the best in the intermittent fasting group with caloric restriction. There wasn't as positive of an effect with the group that was just doing intermittent fasting and not reducing calories. So these results keep pushing home that yes, intermittent fasting has its benefits and can be advantageous to fat loss, but caloric restriction still needs to be there. But if applied one for one, intermittent fasting is more efficient at burning body fat. And keep in mind, this is a randomized controlled study. If you watch my videos, calories in versus calories out, and I explain the tiers in which the studies matter, a randomized controlled trial is like third tier. It gives us better data because it's more accurate. We know how much they ate. We know exactly their macro breakdown. It was equated with the other group, yet they still had more significant fat loss. And to top it off, it was done only with women. That's what makes this study groundbreaking, and we have to continue to move forward with study designs like this. The study was just done in an 8-week period. Granted, it was a short time frame and it was only 88 people, but these are the limitations that must happen when applying such a heavy control. It's either you have a heavy control with a smaller group of people and a smaller time frame, or you have no calorie control with a huge group of people and a very long 1 year, 2 year time frame. But then the accuracy of those studies are going to be skewed. And you can look at this graph here and see how much body fat was actually lost with the intermittent fasting group. And you could also see that the intermittent fasting maintenance group versus the controlled maintenance group still lost more body fat than the controlled maintenance group. So I absolutely love the study design used in this study, and I want to bring these kind of studies to light because there's so many studies that are done with a horrible intermittent fasting design where they actually allow people to eat. 0 caloric intake during the fasting period is the true intermittent fasting study design, and Amy Hutchison set up that perfect design in this study. Not only that, she ensured that it was randomized and controlled, which increases the accuracy of the results. The full breakdown of the study is very, very interesting. I would recommend that you guys take a look at it. I will have the link to the full study down in the description below so you can take a look at it for yourself. And of course, I want to thank my patrons for my Patreon, and I'm going to put their names right up here.